There is a story most people know. A great library, the greatest library the ancient world ever built, full of every book ever written, every idea ever recorded, every secret the ancient mind ever uncovered. And then, one catastrophic night, it burns. The flames rise, the scrolls turn to ash, and centuries of human knowledge vanish forever. A single villain, a single fire, a single moment where civilization took a wound it never fully recovered from. It's a powerful story. It's also almost certainly wrong. Here's the real problem. Ask 10 historians who destroyed the Library of Alexandria, and you'll get 10 different answers. Julius Caesar, a Christian mob, the Roman Emperor Aurelian, the Bishop Theophilus, the Arab Caliph Omar. Each of these answers has ancient sources behind it. Each of them has serious scholars who will defend it, and each of them is, at best, only part of the story. Because what actually happened to the Library of Alexandria isn't a mystery with one culprit hiding in the shadows. It's a mystery with too many culprits, spread across too many centuries, and that makes it far stranger and far more interesting than a single dramatic fire. The core question isn't just who burned it. The deeper question is what the library even means. Was it one building? A network of institutions? A collection of scrolls, or the idea of collecting them at all? When people say the Library of Alexandria was destroyed, what exactly was destroyed? When? And how many times? Because the more you dig into the evidence, the more the whole thing starts to feel less like one catastrophe, and more like a slow unravelling across hundreds of years, with different people, different motivations, different moments of loss, each one chipping away at something that was probably never as permanent or as complete as we imagine. And then there's the question of what was actually at risk. This is where the stakes become genuinely staggering. We're talking about works of Greek philosophy that we know existed but have never read. Mathematical treatises that might have accelerated science by centuries. Medical texts, astronomical observations, geographical surveys, plays, poems, histories of civilizations that left almost no other trace. Some of what was in Alexandria we know we lost because later writers quoted it, and the original is gone. But the really haunting category is what we don't even know we lost. Books we have no record of because every record of them burned too. That's the part that keeps historians up at night. Now, the story of how this happened isn't clean, and it isn't simple, and that's actually what makes it worth understanding properly. Because every time someone points to a single moment of destruction, they're usually missing the larger pattern. The library wasn't just a building full of scrolls. It was a political project, a power structure, a machine built for a very specific purpose by people with very specific ambitions. And once you understand why it was built, you start to understand why it was always vulnerable, and why the idea that it died in one dramatic fire is more about how we want history to work than how it actually does. If you're listening to this right now, whether you're on a late-night drive or lying in bed somewhere trying to shut your brain off, I'd genuinely love to know where you are and what time it is. Drop it in the comments. Last time I checked, there were people from Sao Paulo at midnight and people from Seoul eating breakfast, and somehow that still amazes me every time. So tell me where you are, because we're about to go back roughly 2,300 years to one of the most ambitious experiments in the history of human civilization, and try to figure out not just how it ended, but what it really was in the first place. And the answer is going to surprise you. Here's where most people's mental image breaks down completely. When you picture the Library of Alexandria, you probably picture something like a very grand version of your local public library. Big building, rows of shelves, someone checking scrolls in and out, maybe a dramatic atrium with columns, and then one night, fire. That picture is wrong in almost every important way. The library wasn't primarily a building. It was an institution, and that distinction matters enormously when you're trying to figure out what was actually lost. The heart of it was something the Greeks called the mousion, named after the Muses, and it functioned less like a library and more like a fully funded research campus. Think of it as ancient Alexandria's version of a think tank crossed with a university, except the scholars didn't pay tuition. The Ptolemaic kings paid them. Meals, housing, salaries, administrative support, all of it covered by royal patronage. Scholars came from across the Greek-speaking world to live and work there, to argue with each other, to run experiments, to write, and to access a collection of texts that was unlike anything else in existence. This is the first major thing to understand. The Mouseion and the Great Library were deeply intertwined, but they weren't quite the same thing. The library was the collection. The Mouseion was the community that used it, debated over it, and produced new knowledge because of it. One without the other would have been much less remarkable. And even the library itself wasn't a single building with a single locked door. Alexandria had multiple collections, affiliated archives, a secondary library attached to the Temple of Serapis called the Serapeum, and likely smaller working collections scattered throughout the city. When ancient sources give you a number for how many scrolls the library held, they're probably talking about the main royal collection, but it's never entirely clear which collection they mean or exactly how they're counting. Ancient scroll counts are notoriously unreliable, partly because different sources give wildly different numbers, ranging from 40,000 to 700,000 scrolls depending on who you ask and when they were writing. Part of this variation is probably political. Bigger numbers made the Ptolemies look more impressive. Part of it reflects genuine confusion about what counts as one text. A single long work might be copied across a dozen scrolls, or a dozen short works might share one. The numbers are useful as a rough signal of ambition and scale, not as a precise inventory. What we can say with more confidence is how the scrolls were actually used. Texts were copied, catalogued, and in some cases critically edited. The scholar Callimachus, working in the 3rd century BCE, produced something called the Pinnaces, essentially a comprehensive catalogue of Greek literature organised by genre and author. This was itself a massive intellectual achievement, a bibliographic system for a collection that had grown fast enough to become genuinely difficult to navigate. Scholars at the Mouseion would request specific texts, work with them, annotate them, sometimes produce new editions that corrected errors in earlier copies. It was a working scholarly infrastructure, not a monument to storage, which brings you to how the whole thing got built in the first place. The Ptolemies didn't collect texts out of pure love of reading. They collected them because controlling knowledge was a form of power. Ships arriving in Alexandria's harbour were reportedly searched, and any scrolls found on board were confiscated, copied, and sometimes the copies returned while the original stayed. This is a bureaucratic operation, not a library science project. What ended up in the collection reflected what the royal administration could acquire, what was considered worthy of acquisition, and what the political priorities of the moment happened to be. That patronage structure shaped everything. It meant the collection was extraordinarily rich in certain areas, Greek philosophy, mathematics, medicine, poetry, and potentially thin in others. It meant the whole enterprise depended on royal enthusiasm and royal money, and it meant the library was never a neutral repository of all human thought. It was a curated, politically embedded, institutionally fragile knowledge economy, woven into the fabric of one very specific city. And that city, as you're about to see, had a way of making its institutions vulnerable in ways nobody building them originally intended. So why did they do it? Why would a royal dynasty spend what must have been extraordinary sums of money housing scholars, feeding them, paying their salaries and sending agents across the Mediterranean to hoover up every scroll they could find? The answer isn't complicated, but it's easy to miss if you're thinking about libraries the way we tend to think about them now, as public services, neutral repositories, civic infrastructure. The Ptolemies weren't building a public service. They were building a weapon, a very elegant, very expensive weapon made entirely out of knowledge. Start with the political situation they were born into. When Alexander the Great died in 323 BCE, his generals immediately began carving up his empire like a carcass at a feast. The wars that followed, the Diadochi conflicts, lasted for decades and produced a patchwork of successor kingdoms, all competing for legitimacy, prestige, and territory. Ptolemy I, who grabbed Egypt, understood something that some of his rivals were slower to grasp. Military dominance could be temporary. Cultural dominance was stickier. If you could make Alexandria the undisputed intellectual capital of the Greek-speaking world, you weren't just winning a prestige competition. You were pulling the best minds, the best ideas, and the best reputation toward your city and away from everyone else's. Think about what that meant in practice. Pergamon was building its own library. Antioch had ambitions. Athens still carried the weight of its philosophical history. Every major Hellenistic capital understood that scholarship was a form of soft power, a signal to the rest of the world about who was civilized, who was sophisticated, who deserved to be taken seriously. The Ptolemies decided they were going to win that competition, and they were going to win it decisively. by building something so large and so well funded that no rival could realistically match it. That ambition explains the acquisition practices, and the acquisition practices are worth sitting with for a moment because they tell you something important about how the early library actually grew. It wasn't just that scholars brought their own texts, or that the Ptolemies politely purchased scrolls from booksellers. The operation was considerably more aggressive than that. Ships arriving in Alexandria's harbour were searched, and any books found on board were subject to confiscation. Royal agents travelled to other cities buying up collections, sometimes under circumstances that looked less like commerce and more like compelled sale. The Ptolemies reportedly borrowed the official Athenian state copies of the great tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, ostensibly to make copies for the library, put up a substantial deposit to guarantee the originals would be returned, and then kept the originals anyway, sending back the copies and apparently absorbing the financial penalty as simply the cost of doing business. Whether that specific story is exactly true is hard to verify, but it fits a pattern that multiple ancient sources describe. When the library wanted something, it found a way to get it. The copying practice itself sat in ethically ambiguous territory by any standard, ancient or modern. Making a copy wasn't quite theft in the legal sense, but keeping the original while returning the copy, or simply copying without permission and integrating the text into a royal collection, operated in a grey zone that the Ptolemies seemed entirely comfortable inhabiting. Their logic, if you can reconstruct it, was probably something like this. Knowledge concentrated in one place is more useful than knowledge scattered across 100 private collections, and if the king's collection is the most comprehensive, then the king becomes indispensable to anyone who needs to know anything. That's not a library philosophy, that's a monopoly strategy. But the investment wasn't only about prestige and soft power, it had intensely practical dimensions that made it worthwhile even on purely administrative grounds. Egypt under the Ptolemies was a complex state managing enormous agricultural output, international trade, a diverse multilingual population, and a Mediterranean navy. Accurate geography mattered for navigation and military planning. Mathematics mattered for taxation and infrastructure. Medicine mattered for keeping a labour force and an army functional. Astronomy mattered for the agricultural calendar, which in Egypt was tied directly to the Nile flood cycle, which was tied directly to whether people ate. When Eratosthenes, working at the library, calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy, that wasn't pure abstract curiosity. It was the kind of knowledge that made maritime navigation more reliable and imperial administration more confident. When physicians connected to the mousion, advanced anatomical understanding potentially through the controversial practice of dissecting human cadavers, the benefits flowed eventually into medical care for soldiers and administrators. The library wasn't separate from the machinery of empire, it was part of the machinery. Diplomacy benefited too. When a king could send a letter to a foreign court referencing the latest scholarship from his famous library, or invite a foreign monarch's personal physician to consult with Musion scholars, or demonstrate command of technical knowledge that no rival court could match, it projected a particular kind of authority. This was cultural diplomacy in a form we'd recognise immediately today. The early results were genuinely spectacular, which is partly why the legend grew as large as it did. Within a couple of generations of its founding, the Mousion had produced Euclid's systematic geometry, Eratosthenes' geography, Aristarchus's heliocentric hypothesis, Herophilus's anatomical work, Apollonius of Rhodes's epic poetry, and Callimachus's bibliographic revolution. The concentration of talent and resources in one place produced a cascade of intellectual achievement that outpaced anything happening anywhere else in the ancient world. This wasn't an accident. It was the predictable output of a well-funded institution that attracted brilliant people, gave them time to think, surrounded them with colleagues worth arguing with, and gave them access to texts they couldn't have found anywhere else. But here's the tension that was baked in from the beginning, the one that would eventually matter more than any fire. Everything the library was, it was because of Ptolemaic political will and Ptolemaic money. The universal ambition, the dream of collecting all the world's knowledge in one place, was always dependent on a very particular political structure, remaining intact and enthusiastic. When the dynasty's priorities shifted, the money could shift. When a ruler was more interested in military campaigns than scholarship, the scholars noticed. When court politics turned hostile to a particular intellectual tradition, that tradition became vulnerable in ways it wouldn't have been if the knowledge had been distributed across 100 independent institutions instead of concentrated in one magnificent, royally controlled campus. The Ptolemies had built something extraordinary. They had also built something that could only survive as long as the people who built it wanted it to survive. And in the long run, that was going to be the real problem. What politics builds, politics can also abandon. And abandonment, it turns out, can be just as destructive as fire. So what exactly were they filling all those shelves with? When people hear Library of Alexandria, they tend to imagine a kind of greatest hits playlist of ancient genius. Homer, sure. Euclid, obviously. Maybe a scroll with secrets of the pyramids, written on the tag in some dramatic-looking script. The reality was messier, denser, and in some ways more impressive, because what made Alexandria special wasn't just that it had a lot of scrolls, it was what those scrolls were doing in relation to each other. Start with the big buckets. Poetry and drama were there in force. Homeric epics, lyric poetry, the tragedies and comedies that defined Greek literature. Philosophy, from the early pre-Socratics through Plato and Aristotle, and the sprawling jungle of schools that grew out of them. Mathematics, not just Euclid, but the prehistory that made Euclid possible, and the commentaries that made him readable. Astronomy, including planetary models, star catalogues and practical tables. Medicine and anatomy, some of it shockingly empirical for the time. Geography and ethnography, descriptions of lands, peoples, climates, trade routes, and then commentaries on all of the above, layers of explanation and argument wrapped around older texts like vines around a tree. But the key thing to understand is that they weren't just hoarding these works, they were dissecting them. The library is where literature stopped being just something you recited and started being something you edited. Take Homer. By the time the Ptolemies were collecting, the Iliad and the Odyssey existed in multiple local versions. Lines added, lines missing, different wordings, regional preferences. Alexandrian scholars like Xenodotus and Aristarchus tried to solve this by assembling as many copies as they could, laying them side by side and producing what they called a critical edition, one best text, justified by a chain of argument about which lines were authentic and which were later intrusions. They marked doubtful verses with little symbols, wrote explanations in the margins, and compiled those notes into separate works. That process, textual criticism, spread outward from Homer to tragedy, lyric poetry, even prose historians. The library wasn't just storing Greek culture, it was actively deciding what Greek culture was going to look like for every later reader. If Aristarchus said a line was spurious and left it out, there's a real chance it simply vanished from the manuscript tradition. Canon formation was happening in real time, and it was happening in those rooms. That same critical impulse met a multilingual world. Alexandria wasn't a purely Greek bubble. It sat in Egypt, on top of older Egyptian religious and literary traditions. It pulled in texts from the broader Near East. Babylonian astronomy, Persian materials, maybe even early versions of stories that would later show up in Jewish and Christian scriptures. We know that by the 3rd century BCE, translation was an institutional project. The most famous example is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, traditionally linked to Alexandrian scholarship. But that was part of a larger pattern, taking texts written in local languages and making them legible to the Greek-speaking intellectual elite. That multilingual reality cuts both ways. On one hand, it meant that some non-Greek traditions got a second life, because they were translated into the prestige language of the Eastern Mediterranean. On the other hand, it meant that material that never made it into Greek, Egyptian ritual manuals in Demotic, technical treatises in obscure dialects, administrative records in languages nobody at court cared to learn, were always more vulnerable. If nobody in the Mausion thought a particular text was worth translating, its chances of riding out the centuries dropped sharply. And most of what sat on those shelves wasn't originals in the modern sense anyway. A scroll could be a copy of a copy of a copy, or a working draft, or a scholar's personal version full of corrections. Alongside them were hypomnemata, notes, commentaries, lexica, compilations of rare words, collections of variant readings. For a lot of ancient authors, almost everything we know comes second-hand from that kind of scholarly literature. Lose the commentaries, and you don't just lose explanations. You lose the only quotations of works that were already rare even in antiquity. This is where cataloguing becomes weirdly important. Callimachus, working in Alexandria, created the Pinaces, essentially a multi-volume catalogue of authors and titles arranged by genre, with notes about content and sometimes about quality. Almost none of the Pinnaces survives directly, but later writers lean on it so heavily that we can see its outline. It functioned like a search engine with opinions, signalling whose works existed, how many books they'd written, and which ones mattered. That matters for loss. If you were a later scholar in the Roman period trying to decide what to copy, and your handbook told you that author X wrote 20 treatises, but only 2 were really significant, you might not bother preserving the other 18. Catalogues don't just describe collections, they tilt the table toward what's likely to be recopied and what's allowed to die quietly. So when we talk about what was lost at Alexandria, we have to think in layers. The first things to disappear, almost always, are the local and the technical. City archives with tax records and legal contracts, technical manuals on farming methods, mining, engineering tricks, shipbuilding details, works in minority languages that never got prestige translations, everyday documentation that didn't look glamorous enough for elite scholars to catalogue, comment on, or boast about. Then, further up the pyramid, you start losing the commentaries and scholia, the reference works and lexica that made older texts intelligible. The base text might survive, a tragedy by Aeschylus, say, but the thick Alexandrian scholarship around it evaporates. Future readers still have the work, but their ability to understand its odd words, obscure allusions, or missing context is degraded. Some kinds of loss are like a fire, others are like slowly turning down the dimmer switch. That's why lost forever, in the case of the library, doesn't necessarily mean unique masterpieces of genius burned up in one night and vanished without trace. In some cases, it probably does. But more often, it means whole categories of writing gradually dropping below the horizon of what elites considered worth copying, translating, and cataloguing. Manuals, local histories, experimental treatises, fringe philosophical schools, alternative versions of familiar stories, all the things that didn't get folded into the canon the Alexandrians were busy constructing. So when people say we lost all the knowledge of the ancient world in that fire, they're overstating it. Plenty survived, in other libraries, in Roman copies, in Arabic translations, in Byzantine monasteries. What Alexandria really concentrated, and therefore made especially fragile, was a very particular configuration of that knowledge. The comparisons, the variants, the editorial debates, the multilingual cross-references that let you see the ancient world sideways instead of straight on. That's the loss we're really dealing with, and once you see how dependent that configuration was on fragile scrolls, dense catalogues, and one royal institution's priorities, you can start to understand just how easy it was for the whole thing to start coming apart, even without a single heroic, cinematic blaze. To really feel how precarious Alexandria was, you have to zoom in on the basic unit of all this ambition, a single papyrus scroll. Papyrus is not some immortal Indiana Jones-proof artifact. It's mashed river plant, pressed and dried. In a dry, stable environment, it can last a surprising amount of time. That's why we find papyri in Egyptian tombs and rubbish heaps that are over 2,000 years old. But those survivals are the exception, not the rule. They come from the desert, from sealed jars, from places where almost nothing ever changes. Alexandria was not that. It was a crowded, humid, sea breeze city. Salt air, fluctuating temperatures, smoke from lamps, human breath, all of it working slowly on those fibres. Add insects that love starch, rodents that chew anything soft, mold spores just waiting for a damp corner, and every scroll becomes an active battleground. The enemy isn't a dramatic wall of flame, it's a small grey spot on the edge of the roll that, if ignored for a few seasons, quietly eats its way inward. And that's before you even get to people. A scroll is a machine designed to be worn down by use. You unroll it, roll it back up, over and over. The outer layers crack. The inner layers pick up oils and dirt from fingers. Edges fray. If a line you need happens to sit along a crease that splits, it's just gone. There's no autosave, no backup. The more important and frequently read a work is, the more physical stress it experiences. Popularity is literally corrosive. So the only way this system works at all is through constant labour. Copying. Copying wasn't a quaint side activity. It was the beating heart of scroll culture. Every text existed on a kind of ticking clock. At some point the physical object would become unreadable. The only way to stop the countdown was to invest time, materials, and trained expertise into turning that dying scroll into a fresh one. That means scribes. People who could not only write clearly, but read what might already be half-faded, deal with variant readings, decide which bits to keep, when two exemplars disagreed. In a place like Alexandria, that labour could be semi-industrial. You could imagine rooms of copyists working under supervision, churning out new versions of authors that the librarians and scholars prioritised. But that prioritised part is the catch. Every copy cost money: papyrus sheets, ink, wages, storage space. The Ptolemies were rich, but they weren't infinite. That set up a series of selection pressures that quietly sculpted the library's contents long before anyone attacked the city. If you're managing a budget and a staff, what do you recopy? Homer, obviously. Canonical tragedians, the big-name philosophers, the mathematical handbooks you actually use to train students, the standard medical texts, things with prestige, classroom utility, or ideological weight. What drops to the bottom of the list? A minor local historian whose work duplicates someone more famous. A technical treatise in a niche field that no current scholar champions. A religious text from a community without much political clout at court. A commentary on a poet nobody is teaching this decade. None of these are censored in some dramatic way. They're just not recopied this year, or next year, or ever again. That's the cruel arithmetic. In a scroll-based system, every text is in a race against depreciation and disinterest. The winners become classics. The losers evaporate. Now add physical storage into the picture. Scrolls aren't just fragile individually, they're fragile collectively. You need shelves, cupboards, rooms designed to keep them as dry and pest-free as possible. You have to organise them so that people can actually find what they're looking for without constantly dragging half the collection into the light, exposing more to handling damage. And you have to do all this in a dense Hellenistic city built largely of stone, wood and plaster. Fire is not some once-a-century freak event. It's an everyday threat. Cooking, heating, lamps, incense, workshops, all using open flame or embers. A fire that starts 2 blocks away can, under the right wind, leap roofs and arcades before anyone organises a bucket chain. Even if the library precinct has its own safety protocols, it's not sitting in a vacuum. It's embedded in an urban organism that's always a little flammable. Urban density amplifies every disaster. A minor roof leak in one building is an annoyance. In a complex with interconnected halls and shared walls, that leak can propagate damp into multiple rooms. Mould doesn't respect catalogue boundaries. Neither do rats. Once they're in, they travel along the same convenient human-made pathways that readers and scholars use. This is where institutional continuity becomes everything. Scrolls do not preserve themselves. They require a living ecosystem. Trained scribes, cataloguers who know what exists and where it is, scholars who care enough about obscure works to advocate for their recopying, administrators willing to allocate funds, artisans who can maintain the buildings and the shelves. As long as that institutional machine is humming, the library can fight entropy. Not perfectly, but enough that a surprising amount survives. But pull out a few pieces and the system starts to wobble. A funding crunch means fewer copyists. A change in royal priorities shifts patronage toward glamorous court poetry and away from dry technical manuals. A political purge removes a particular scholarly circle, and with them the only people who knew or cared about certain authors. A war or civil disturbance interrupts salaries, scatters staff, closes reading rooms temporarily. None of this looks like a famous catastrophe. It looks like delays, backlogs, boxes of damaged scrolls waiting for conservation that never comes, rooms closed for repairs that drag on for years. When staff turn over, the memory of what's in those rooms fades faster than the ink on the papyrus. Neglect is an arsonist that works in slow motion. You don't need a single night of terror to take out a specialised corpus of astronomical observations if, for 2 generations, nobody bothers to keep those texts in circulation. You don't need an invading army to erase a niche medical school if its treatises simply aren't recopied as the physical copies age. Each individual decision is rational. This year we focus on X, we can't afford everything. Y and Z will wait. Then the binding cracks, the ink flakes, the pests get in, and there's nothing left to save. By the time Caesar's fleet shows up in the harbour, or any other headline-grabbing villain you prefer, this quiet erosion has already been at work for decades, maybe centuries. the famous disasters become accelerants poured onto a structure that's already been hollowed out in places. So when we start assigning blame for what Alexandria lost, we have to start here, with a medium that decays, a technology that depends on constant, expensive human attention, and a set of incentives that always tilt towards some voices and away from others. The fire that destroyed the library might be less a single blaze and more a long, uneven smoulder, punctuated now and then by visible sparks. In the next section, when Caesar's name finally enters the story, that slow burn is already well underway. By the time Julius Caesar shows up, Alexandria is already a place where knowledge survival is a daily uphill battle. But if you ask most people today who burned the Library of Alexandria, they don't talk about mould or underfunding. They point to one man in one war. So what actually happened when Caesar came to town? It's 48 BCE. Caesar is in the middle of a Roman civil war, chasing his rival Pompey across the Mediterranean. Pompey flees to Egypt, hoping the young king Ptolemy XIII will help him. Instead, Ptolemy has Pompey murdered on the beach, then proudly presents Caesar with the severed head, expecting gratitude. Caesar is not impressed. Before long, he's entangled in Egypt's own civil war between Ptolemy XIII and his sister Cleopatra. The Roman general who thought he was just dropping by to tie up loose ends suddenly finds himself holed up in the royal quarter of Alexandria with a relatively small force, surrounded by a hostile city and an army that technically belongs to his Egyptian allies. In that cramped, high-stakes urban battlefield, the harbour becomes everything. Control the harbour, and you control reinforcements, supplies, and escape routes. Lose it, and you're a Roman hero who dies embarrassingly far from Rome. That's where the fire enters the story. Ancient sources agree on a few basic points. Under pressure, Caesar orders ships in the harbour to be burned, probably to prevent the enemy from using the Egyptian fleet against him. Fires start among the vessels and spread to parts of the docks and adjacent structures. There is serious damage in the port area. Later writers say that damage included buildings where books and scrolls were stored. But notice what that description is not. It is not, Caesar marched into the great library with torches and burned the shelves. It's a chaotic defensive manoeuvre in a port city, with collateral fire damage as the wind carries sparks where they weren't supposed to go. If you ask, do any contemporary sources say, Caesar burned the great library? The answer is no. The earliest accounts, closer to the events, talk about ships and warehouses going up. Strabo, who lived in Alexandria a few decades later, and actually describes the Museion complex, doesn't describe it as a smouldering ruin. Plutarch, writing over a century later, mentions that a fire during Caesar's fighting destroyed many or great book collections stored in depots by the harbour. Then, over the centuries, the story inflates. Later writers who never saw Alexandria start connecting that port fire with the library, capital L, as a singular, almost sacred institution. Medieval and early modern authors, already inclined to see Caesar as an overreaching conqueror, find moral satisfaction in blaming him for the destruction of the greatest library in the ancient world. It becomes a neat story. One man's ambition, one careless act, one irreplaceable loss. The problem is, Alexandria was not a single room with all the knowledge of the world stacked inside. It was a citywide ecosystem of texts. The main Museion complex, with its famed reading rooms and catalogued shelves, was in the royal quarter, away from the commercial docks. But Alexandria being Alexandria, books did not live only inside that elite precinct. You had storage depots where newly acquired scrolls were held before being processed, warehouses where books seized from incoming ships were copied and sorted, commercial book dealers and copy shops clustered near the harbour and major thoroughfares, overflow storage for the palace and temples in buildings that shared walls or courtyards with more mundane urban structures. In that kind of layout, a serious dockside fire is like shaking a citywide network of shelves and boxes. You don't need the flames to reach the core library building to do real damage. If a warehouse holds thousands of unprocessed or duplicate texts, waiting to be evaluated by librarians, and that warehouse burns, you've just thinned out the pipeline. If a customs depot full of confiscated scrolls goes up, that's a chunk of the incoming supply destroyed in one night. Think about what those harbourside storerooms likely contained. Books in transit, collections bought from abroad but not yet integrated, shipboard libraries from elite travellers temporarily stored while ships were refurbished, confiscated copies taken from merchants so that the Museion could produce its own versions. all the messy, interim material a gigantic library system generates. A fire through that zone is like a hard drive crash that wipes out your downloads folder, your unsorted research, your in-progress work. You don't lose the entire institution, but you lose momentum, variety and raw material. Could flame and flying embers have reached secondary storage tied more closely to the main collection? In a tightly packed marble and wood city, absolutely. Roofs shared beams, courtyards connected complexes that, on a ground plan, look separate. Even if the core reading rooms are protected, an outer ring of annexes, storage corridors and satellite collections could be damaged or destroyed. So was this the destruction of the Library of Alexandria? Almost certainly not in the total cinematic sense. The simple fact that Alexandria remains a major intellectual centre for centuries after Caesar tells us that whatever burned in 48 BCE, the core institutional machine survived. Scholars keep working, the library's reputation persists. Later rulers and visitors still talk about the city as a place of books and learning. What seems far more plausible is a partial, messy loss. A hit to portside collections, commercial stock or overflow storage that never gets fully repaired. A culling that no one in the moment fully grasps because in a scroll culture you never see everything at once. You just gradually discover years later that some works you expected to find aren't there anymore. This is where uncertainty creeps in and never quite leaves. Our sources are late, biased and sometimes clearly moralizing. They want heroes and villains. They want clean cause and effect. Caesar burned the ships and some books in the harbour, and over the next few generations the cumulative effects of that damage, plus pre-existing neglect, plus changing priorities, quietly narrowed the range of texts available in Alexandria is not a satisfying campfire story. But historically it's closer to how disasters work. So why did the Caesar burned the library story become so sticky? Because it's morally useful. It turns a complex slow-motion decay into a single cautionary tale about arrogance and war. It lets later writers make big points about the fragility of civilization, the hubris of conquerors, or the wickedness of pagan Rome, depending on their agenda. One match, one man, one library. Lesson delivered. In reality, the fire during the Alexandrian War looks more like an accelerant poured onto an already stressed system. Some collections near the harbour go up in smoke. The institution reallocates resources. Priorities narrow. Certain kinds of texts, especially those that lived closer to commerce and transit than to palace prestige, may never fully recover. The library survives, but thinner, more centralised, a little more brittle. Its ability to buffer future shocks is reduced, and those future shocks are coming. Street battles, religious riots, regime changes. Each new disturbance doesn't need to annihilate the library from scratch. It just has to push a weakened, sprawling institution a little further toward fragmentation. In the next section, we'll watch that happen as the library stops being a single royal project and turns into something harder to see and even easier to damage. By the time Rome fully takes over Egypt, that royal, centralized version of the library you probably imagine is already slipping away. Under the early Ptolemies, the Museion and its collections are a prestige project. The kings pour money into it the way modern states pour money into space programs or particle colliders. It's not just about loving books, it's propaganda. Look how rich and powerful we are. We don't just conquer territories, we conquer knowledge, but empires age. By the 1st century BCE and into the Roman period, the Ptolemaic dynasty is a shadow of what it was. Civil wars, debt, foreign intervention. None of that is good for expensive long-term cultural projects. You can see the drift in the sources. We still hear about scholars, about books, about Alexandria's reputation, but the golden age image of unlimited royal patronage fades. Then Rome steps in. The Romans like the idea of Alexandria as a place of books. They like plundering those books for their own libraries. Emperors like Domitian and Hadrian are said to have sent scribes and money to replenish collections in Rome using Alexandrian copies. That only works if Alexandria is still a serious textual hub. But the priorities have flipped. For the Ptolemies, the Museion is a symbol of dynastic greatness. For Rome, it's an asset in a larger imperial portfolio. Useful, prestigious, but not sacred. The emperors don't live in Alexandria. They have no childhood memories of its lecture halls. To them, it's one wealthy provincial city among many, not the beating heart of their cultural identity. Put bluntly, The library goes from being the crown jewel to being a line item. That changes everything. Funding becomes inconsistent. Maintenance is harder to guarantee. Royal scholars no longer have the same direct pipeline to the throne. The famous stipends, free meals, housing for intellectuals, those perks may shrink, become politicized, or be redirected toward other kinds of elites. And when any institution that depends on constant care stops being someone's obsession and starts being one more thing to manage, it begins to mutate. We see that mutation in how the library seems to spread, fragment, and reappear in different guises. One of the clearest examples is the Serapeum. The Serapeum is a grand temple complex in the southwestern part of the city, dedicated to the god Serapis, a deliberately hybrid deity, Greek and Egyptian at once. By the Roman period, ancient writers describe a daughter library or secondary book collection associated with it. Later sources talk about the Serapeum as if it has taken on some of the intellectual and archival functions once centered in the royal quarter. Was this a formal branch of the original library, a backup, a spin-off created when the core institution lost resources and needed to shift activity into temple-controlled spaces? The evidence isn't neat enough to say for sure, but whatever the exact legal relationship, it tells us something important. By the imperial period, Alexandria's learned books are not confined to one palace complex. They're part of a city-wide ecosystem anchored in multiple institutions, court, temples, schools, private households, and that makes the library harder to see. Under the early Ptolemies, you can imagine a visitor being taken to a specific place. This is the Mausion. These are the royal collections. Here is Callimachus's catalogue on its neat little pinax. Under Rome, what does a visiting intellectual see? They might consult texts housed in the Serapeum's library. They might work with books in a scholar's private collection. They might borrow copies from a teacher attached to a philosophical school. They might deal with commercial book dealers who have their own warehouses and scriptoriums. The knowledge that once clustered in and around the Mausion is now spread over dozens or hundreds of smaller, overlapping archives. Paradoxically, that diffusion can make knowledge more resilient and more vulnerable at the same time. More resilient because ideas are no longer hostage to one building. A commentary on Homer can exist in the Serapeum, in a grammarian's personal chest, in a provincial teacher's library in Antioch, in a Roman senator's villa outside Naples. Once text starts circulating as part of elite education across the empire, Alexandria stops being the only point of failure. But more vulnerable, because institutional memory gets hazier. Catalogues don't necessarily travel with the books. The famous pinax, those systematic lists of authors and works, do not survive. What we probably get instead are local inventories, partial lists, and above all commentaries. Commentaries are one of the main ways ancient knowledge outlives original shelves. A scholar in Roman Alexandria doesn't just read an old treatise. They summarize it, argue with it, quote key passages. Another scholar a century later writes a commentary on the commentary. Teachers create abridged versions for students. Scribes copy those abridgments in cheaper formats. By the time you get to late antiquity, the original complete work might be gone from every shelf on earth. But thin, stubborn strands of it are woven through layers of derivative writing. The same is true for catalogues. Even if Callimachus's master list vanished as a book you could pull from a shelf, its structure, what counts as an author, what genres exist, which names are canonical, lives on inside later literary histories, biographies, anthologies. Scholars may no longer be sitting in the original reading rooms, but they're still using taxonomies and judgments invented there. From a historian's perspective, this is maddening. When you look for the Library of Alexandria, in the Roman and late antique sources, the sharp outline you had for the early Ptolemaic period blurs. The Mausion is mentioned less as a physical complex and more as a memory, a prestige label. You see signs of serious scholarship, you see books moving in and out, you see temple libraries like the Serapeum taking on more of the load. But the tidy mental picture of one institution fades. Instead, there's a swarm. Scholars, teachers, copyists, priests, bureaucrats, all participating in something that still has Alexandrian DNA, but not necessarily Alexandrian walls. This is where decline stops looking like a single cliff and starts looking like coastal erosion. Funding wavers, political regimes change, royal patronage turns into bureaucratic oversight. The core institution thins out while its functions are gradually outsourced into temples and private circles. Each transition introduces new points of failure, a priestly faction that hates pagan philosophy, a governor who resents the cost of maintenance, a wealthy patron who dies without a clear heir committed to his books. So when later shocks hit, riots, purges, religious crackdowns, they aren't attacking a pristine monolithic library. They're hitting a landscape of partially overlapping archives, some already underfunded, some already hollowed out, some thriving but politically exposed, and that has a crucial implication for the destruction of the Library of Alexandria. You don't necessarily need one catastrophic blaze to erase a world of books. You just need a long enough period when no one feels responsible for keeping the whole network alive. A royal-scale project that has already drifted into a set of smaller, more fragile institutions is far easier to damage piecemeal. In the next section, we'll see what happens when that fragile, scattered ecosystem meets something Alexandria has always been very good at producing: street violence, factional hatred, and crowds who believe they're defending the true faith by tearing someone else's world down. Alexandria is not a peaceful city. From almost the moment it's founded, it has a reputation for being volatile, loud, and politically explosive. Ancient authors complain about Alexandrian mobs the way modern commentators complain about social media, always outraged, always mobilized, always one insult away from chaos. Part of that is baked into the city's design. You've got a massive, dense urban space stitched together from competing communities. Greeks who see themselves as heirs of Alexander, native Egyptians with their own temple networks and traditions, large Jewish communities with deep roots and their own institutions, later on Christian groups that don't even agree with each other, plus Roman administrators trying to keep all of this pointed in the same direction. They share streets, markets, and water supplies. They do not share a single identity. In that environment, arguments don't stay theoretical for long. A theological dispute about the nature of Christ, or a policy change from a distant emperor, can turn into bodies in the streets within days. Add grain shortages, tax demands, and local demagogues looking for followers, and Alexandria becomes a pressure cooker. When the pressure blows, elites and institutions are right in the blast radius. Governors, bishops, priests, and philosophers are not sitting in some secluded suburb. They're woven into the urban fabric. Their buildings are landmarks. Their processions move through the same streets the crowds use. Their reputations circulate in gossip and rumour. The library, in all its later scattered forms, lives in that environment. It's easy to imagine riots as two symmetric groups clashing in a square, but in a city like Alexandria, unrest has a direction. Crowds look for symbols. They look for places that represent the people they blame. Sometimes that means palaces. Sometimes that means synagogues. Sometimes that means temples. And sometimes it means any building associated with a hated official, an unpopular tax, or the wrong version of God. Cultural institutions are perfect targets. A temple that houses a library isn't just a religious space. It's a symbol of wealth, of education, of authority. The serapeum, for example, looms over the city both physically and symbolically. It's tied to older cults, to philosophical schools, to networks of privilege that not everyone benefits from equally. If you're part of a faction that feels marginalized or persecuted, tearing down that symbol is a way of saying, your world doesn't rule here anymore. You don't even need to consciously think about the books. When a crowd storms a complex, they break statues, burn furniture, smash doors, loot anything portable and valuable. Scrolls stored in side rooms are just part of the debris field. A fire meant to destroy a cult image doesn't stop at the threshold of the archive. It moves through whatever wood, papyrus, wax and cloth the complex happens to contain. And that's the key. Factional conflict doesn't have to be about knowledge for it to obliterate knowledge. The people most committed to preserving texts, scholars, priests, copyists, are particularly vulnerable in these moments. They're not soldiers. They're not necessarily aligned with the most powerful faction. Often, they're associated with an old regime or a religious group that has just lost its grip on the city's politics. If your stipend comes from a temple whose god has fallen out of favour, if your lecture hall relies on a patron who is suddenly on the wrong side of a doctrinal dispute, you have three options when the knives come out: flee, keep your head down, or hope your connections can protect you. A lot of them flee. When they do, they don't take everything. A scholar might roll up a few prized manuscripts and carry them to a safer city, but the majority of the collection, especially bulky, old, or non-essential works, stays behind. Maybe it survives in untouched storerooms. Maybe it gets looted. Maybe it moulds quietly when no one pays the rent on that space anymore. Either way, the community that knew what was there is gone. This is one of the hidden mechanisms of loss, the dispersal of intellectual communities. You can burn shelves, but you can also just scatter the people who know how those shelves are organised, who has copies of where the good scribes are, which texts are rare and which are common. Every major episode of unrest in Alexandria, whether sparked by ethnic tensions, theological rivalries, or imperial politics, risks triggering waves of exile, forced migration, and career change among exactly those people. And every time that happens, administrative continuity takes a hit. Catalogues go out of date because the person who maintained them is dead or in Antioch. Temple treasuries that funded copying projects are seized and redistributed. A bishop or prefect who used to care about keeping this or that school running is replaced by someone who has other priorities. Construction and maintenance on storerooms and reading rooms gets postponed, then postponed again, then quietly cancelled. Neglect is not dramatic, but it's lethal to a paper or papyrus-based ecosystem. Scroll culture needs constant work: recopying, drying, pest control, cleaning, repairs to roofs and doors. In a tranquil, well-funded city, you can keep doing that decade after decade. In a city where every few years a new faction takes power and starts purging the last one's allies, long-term projects become very fragile, looting piles on top of that. During uprisings and crackdowns, soldiers and civilians alike grab what they can. Bronze fittings, statues, fancy furniture, but also loose scrolls that look like they might fetch a price as wrapping materials, scrap, or even as Sat's antiques in a black market for curiosities. Texts get stripped of context, separated from their metadata, and drift into private hands where they may or may not be read, may or may not be copied, and may simply disintegrate. No single riot needs to wipe out the library. Instead, you get a staircase of damage, a riot that smashes part of a temple, a purge that executes or exiles leading teachers, a famine that diverts temple funds to emergency grain purchases, a new governor who hates the old elite's pet projects. Each step seems survivable on its own. Together, over centuries, they hollow out the city's knowledge infrastructure more thoroughly than any one night of flames. This is why repeated shocks can be more destructive than a single catastrophe. Imagining one climactic blaze is emotionally satisfying. It gives you a before and after, a villain, a date to circle. But in a city like Alexandria, the real story looks more like chronic illness than sudden death. Riots, military crackdowns, and civic violence act like recurring fevers, each one stripping away a bit more institutional memory, a bit more material, a bit more human capital. And that brings us to a crucial shift in perspective. By the time we're in the thick of these conflicts, the heart of Alexandria's scholarly world is no longer any single room full of scrolls. It's the people, the grammarians, mathematicians, commentators, theologians, physicians, and students, whose conversations, marginal notes, and teaching lineages carry the city's intellectual DNA. When those people are killed, terrorized into silence, or driven out, the library loses something it can't get back just by buying more papyrus. You can rebuild shelves. You can't easily recreate a dense, multi-generational community with shared standards, arguments, and memories. And in late antique Alexandria, the waves of civic violence start to have a new flavour. They aren't just about bread prices or local grudges. Increasingly, they're tied to religious identities and imperial power. Pagan versus Christian, one Christian doctrine versus another, bishops versus prefects, monks versus philosophers. Those later conflicts, focused on temples like the Serapeum and on the city's Christian and imperial institutions, will take Alexandria's already fragile, fragmented knowledge ecosystem and subject it to some of its harshest tests yet. To understand why late antique Alexandria feels like a turning point, you have to follow the story uphill to a building that isn't technically the library at all, but keeps getting treated like its ghost, the Serapeum. Imagine a temple complex sitting on the city's southwestern hill dominating the skyline, dedicated to Serapis, a hybrid Greek-Egyptian god invented by the early Ptolemies to glue their new multicultural kingdom together. It's part religious sanctuary, part political statement, part cultural hub. This is not the original Mausion. It's not the palace complex where the first Ptolemies bankrolled scholars to catalogue the world. It's a different institution, in a different neighbourhood, with a different architecture and a different god at its centre. But it matters to the library story because, by the Roman and late Roman periods, a lot of the city's bookish activity has leaked out of the royal quarter and into places like this. Sources hint that the serapeum housed lecture halls, philosophical schools, and some kind of collection of books. Later writers explicitly call it a daughter library, or a continuation of the older scholarly tradition. Even if those labels are partly nostalgic branding, they tell you how people thought about the place. A temple, yes, but also a site of learning, archives, and prestige. By the late 4th century, that combination, pagan temple plus intellectual authority, puts a giant target on its back. The Roman Empire is changing religion in real time. In the early 300s, emperors are still sacrificing to the old gods. By the 380s, Christian bishops are wielding serious political power, and imperial laws are turning gradually but unmistakably against traditional cults. The timeline is messy, but the trend is clear. Emperors like Constantine and his successors favour Christian clergy with tax breaks and legal privileges. By Theodosius I, you start seeing explicit bans on certain sacrifices and divination rituals. Local officials have leeway in how aggressively they enforce these edicts, but the message from the top is shifting. Old temples are no longer guaranteed imperial protection. In Alexandria, that plays out in a particularly volatile way. You've got a powerful, ambitious Christian bishop, Theophilus, backed by networks of monks and urban Christians. You've got shrinking but still influential pagan elites whose social life and identity are tied to temples and philosophical schools. You've got a Roman prefect trying, not always successfully, to keep order and follow imperial directives without blowing up the city. And you've got the serapeum, wealthy, symbolically loaded, perched on a hill, associated with the old religion, and with intellectual circles that Christians increasingly view as competitors or enemies. When tensions spike in the 390s, the serapeum becomes a fortress. A conflict starts. Our sources disagree about the exact spark, and some pagans and their supporters retreat into the serapeum complex. They barricade themselves, seize hostages, and according to Christian accounts, commit atrocities inside. This is reported to the emperor. Theodosius issues a ruling, pardon the people, but allow the destruction of the temple. That decision is the hinge. Christian authors like Socrates, Scholasticus, and Rufinus describe what happens next with the vividness of victors. The great image of Serapis is toppled. The temple buildings are torn apart, cult statues are smashed. They portray it as an exorcism of demonic power and a triumph of the true faith, not as an attack on a library. Do they mention books? Yes, but in side comments. We hear about libraries attached to temples, about book chests being burned or looted, about shelves of scrolls being destroyed along with idols. Later writers, looking back, explicitly connect the serapeum to the old Alexandrian library and imply that what survived earlier disasters may have perished here. The evidence is frustratingly indirect. No surviving source gives us a neat inventory. No one says, and thus perished the last 40,000 scrolls of the Mausion. What we get instead are hints, mentions of book collections in the serapeum, suggestions that it held philosophical and scientific works, and later rhetorical flourishes that fold this episode into the larger myth of the library's death. So what was actually there? Most historians think the serapeum likely contained a substantial library, whether as a continuation of the Ptolemaic book collections or as an independent later archive built up under Roman and local patronage. It probably housed commentaries on classical authors, philosophical treatises, astronomical and medical works, local administrative records, and religious texts tied to the cult. But by the 390s, a lot of the big-name material associated with the original royal library had already been through centuries of copying, dispersal, and relocation. Scrolls don't sit in one building for 600 years and remain usable. They flake, they mould, they get replaced. Scholars chase better copies. Texts migrate to private collections, to other cities' libraries, to Christian scriptoria that are starting to copy useful pagan works into codices. So when Christian mobs and imperial officials tear down the serapeum, they may be hitting the last big, visible symbol of Alexandrian pagan scholarship, but not necessarily the last physical copy of every text ever stored behind those walls. There's also the quiet, preemptive evacuation factor. Pagan elites weren't stupid. They could read the legal climate. If you see temple property being threatened, if you hear sermons denouncing your god, if imperial rescripts start targeting idols, you move what you can. Some manuscripts may have been spirited out and hidden in private homes, rural estates, smaller shrines, or even shipped to friendlier cities. Teachers with connections in Athens, Antioch, or Constantinople may have left with a handful of prized texts under their cloaks long before the final assault. What remains when the demolition crews come is likely a mix. Some still valuable works that were too bulky or too integrated into temple routines to remove quickly, plus a lot of older, less used, or less portable material that becomes collateral damage when statues fall and fires spread. Over the next centuries, the memory of all this gets blurred. Later Christian writers want a story about the defeat of paganism, not an archival audit. Pagan and secular authors, when they look back, want to emphasize the scale of loss and the injustice of it all. Medieval and early modern storytellers, hearing fragments about a great temple with a library in Alexandria that was destroyed by Christians, splice it together with older tales about Caesar's fire, with hazy memories of the Mausion, and with later legends about Arab conquerors. Different sites, different dates, different culprits melt into one composite tragedy: the burning of the Library of Alexandria. That's how a temple complex on a hill becomes, in popular imagination, synonymous with the original royal library by the harbour, even though structurally and historically they're not the same thing. The Mausion was a state-funded research institute tied directly to the Ptolemaic court, deeply integrated with palace politics and Hellenistic royal ideology. The Serapeum was a grand urban sanctuary, with its own priesthood, cult practices, and educational functions that only gradually took on a library role in the Roman period. Confusing them flattens centuries of institutional evolution into a single before and after picture. But even if we strip away that confusion, the fall of the Serapeum still feels like a turning point. Not because we can point to a precise number of scrolls and say, this many died. We can't. The physical loss might have been smaller than the legend suggests, or it might have included unique local archives we'll never even know we're missing. What makes it decisive is the symbolism and the direction of travel. An imperial edict, enforced on the ground by a Christian bishop and his allies, authorizes the destruction of one of the city's most prominent pagan, scholarly, and cultural complexes. The gods of the old intellectual order are literally pulled down. The physical spaces where philosophers and priests had debated for generations are turned into rubble. Whatever texts survived in hiding now do so without institutional cover. Whatever lines of transmission continue have to adapt to a world where the biggest, most visible pagan knowledge centre in Alexandria is gone, and Christian institutions are setting the terms of what gets copied, quoted, or ignored. After the Serapeum falls, the story of learning in Alexandria doesn't end, but it moves decisively into a new phase, one in which the memory of the library becomes something people argue about, mythologize and weaponize, even as the last tangible pieces of that old ecosystem slip quietly out of view. By the time Arab armies arrive outside Alexandria's walls in the 600s and 40s, we're not dealing with the same city that courted Euclid and Eratosthenes. The old Mausion is long gone. The Serapeum is a ruin. Alexandria is still important. Still a major port, still a tax engine, still a place with churches, monasteries, and schools. But it's a late antique, Christian, administratively battered Alexandria, not the gleaming Ptolemaic science park people picture when they hear Library of Alexandria. And yet, this is where one of the most famous library burning stories lands. In its most popular form, it goes like this. The Muslim general Amr ibn al-As conquers Alexandria. Inside the city, the victorious Arabs find a vast collection of Greek books, the last remnant of the ancient library. Unsure what to do, Amr writes to the Caliph Umar in Medina for instructions. Umar supposedly replies with a line that has been quoted ever since, something like, "If those books agree with the Book of God, we do not need them. If they contradict it, destroy them." So the story says the books are distributed to Alexandria's public baths, where the scrolls and codices are used as fuel to heat bathwater for months. It's a vivid image. The last sparks of Greek philosophy and science, literally burned away as kindling for a new religious order. There's just one enormous problem. We don't see this story until centuries after the alleged events. Our earliest detailed versions come from Christian authors writing under Islamic rule in the 12th and 13th centuries. People like the Syriac bishop Bar Hebraeus and the Coptic writer Al-Makrizi is actually 15th century, but other Christian Arabic chronicles earlier. None of the 7th or 8th century Muslim historians who are otherwise obsessed with the conquests mention a book bonfire in Alexandria. Neither do early Christian sources who hated the conquests and would have loved a story that made the new rulers look like barbarians. For an event that would have been catnip to every polemicist in the Mediterranean, the silence is loud. That's why many modern historians treat the Umar burned the library episode with extreme suspicion. It looks less like a contemporary report and more like a legend that crystallized later, shaped by the arguments and anxieties of people living long after the fact. And those arguments are important. For medieval Christian communities under Islamic rule, there's a strong incentive to craft stories that draw a bright line between our civilization and theirs. A tale where a caliph casually orders the destruction of the greatest library in history is doing a lot of ideological work. It casts Greek learning as ours by inheritance, paints Muslims as enemies of reason, and explains the loss of ancient texts as the fault of the current political overlords, not as the result of centuries of shared neglect, conflict and chance. Flip the script and you see why some Muslim scholars later felt the need to respond, either by ignoring the story, reinterpreting it, or pointing toward episodes where Muslim rulers actively patronized Greek science and preserved texts that might otherwise have disappeared. This is what polemics does to the past. Library burnings become moral parables. They're no longer just about what actually happened in a particular city on a particular day. They turn into shorthand for entire civilizations, who values knowledge, who destroys it, who counts as the rightful heir of Plato and Aristotle. You can see the same pattern in other myths. Christians blaming barbarian Goths for wrecking Rome, even when the archaeological record shows slow decay and internal problems. Early modern Europeans blaming fanatical Spaniards for burning indigenous books in the Americas, while quietly ignoring their own archival destructions closer to home. We like neat villains, we like single moments when everything is lost. They make complicated, messy declines easier to talk about and easier to weaponize. So what was Alexandria actually like by the 7th century when the Arab armies arrived? Think of a city that has been through repeated earthquakes, riots, purges and regime changes. A city where much of the classical educational system has been Christianized, where bishops and monks run schools, where Greek philosophy survives filtered through commentaries and theological debates. We know there are still scholars here, figures like John Philoponus in the 6th century, arguing about Aristotle, astronomy and logic. We know there are still archives, both secular and ecclesiastical. There are tax records, legal documents, theological treatises, medical handbooks. What we don't have evidence for is a single, unified, state-backed great library, anything like the Ptolemaic Mouseion. Scroll culture has largely given way to codices. Texts are scattered across monasteries, church libraries, private collections, bureaucratic offices. The infrastructure of learning is decentralized. The fragile dream of one building holding all the books of the world has been dead for a very long time. That doesn't mean nothing could be lost in the transition from Byzantine to Arab rule. Conquest is disruptive, even when it's relatively orderly. New tax systems, new elites, new languages of administration. Some institutions get patronage, others get sidelined or shut down. In that turbulence, smaller collections and local archives are vulnerable. Imagine a bishop's library tied to an office the new regime abolishes, or a private philosophical school that loses its student base and funding, or a small temple-turned-church on the outskirts that still had a chest of old scholastic texts nobody's really using anymore. Those are the kinds of places where a few unique manuscripts could quietly vanish, through neglect, repurposing, or deliberate cleanup, without anyone writing a dramatic chronicle entry about it. Firewood, scrap parchment, reused bindings, simple damp and insects in a building no one maintains anymore. These kill more texts than all the famous bonfires combined. Could Arab authorities in Alexandria have ordered the destruction of particular texts, especially ones seen as theologically dangerous or politically suspect? Possibly. We know later Muslim rulers elsewhere sometimes targeted specific works or genres. Could there have been incidents where books were burned in the course of suppressing rebellions or confiscating church property? Also possible. What we lack is good, contemporary evidence for a single, city-wide Library of Alexandria style purge tied directly to Umar's decree. So what can we responsibly say? By the 7th century, the classical library complex founded by the Ptolemies no longer existed as an institution. Alexandria still housed books and learning, but in dispersed, mostly Christian settings. The Arab conquest undoubtedly changed which institutions thrived, which languages of scholarship were favoured, and which local archives got maintained or allowed to rot. It is entirely plausible that some small but significant caches of late antique texts disappeared in that transition. It is not well supported to claim that a caliph's order burned the original Library of Alexandria to heat baths for 6 months, and that gap between what feels satisfying and what the sources actually support is the real lesson here. The stories people tell about the library's final destruction aren't just about scrolls and codices. They're about who we think we are. Rational versus fanatical. Civilized versus barbarian. Heirs of Athens versus enemies of enlightenment. Every era projects its own anxieties onto Alexandria. Christian polemicists in the Middle Ages use the Muslim conquest story to mourn and to accuse. 19th century Orientalist writers revive it to paint Islam as antithetical to reason. Modern defenders of Islamic civilization flip the narrative and showcase Baghdad and Cordoba as the true preservers of Greek learning, implicitly accusing Christian Europe of being the real destroyer. In each case, Alexandria becomes a mirror. What you see burning in that mirror says more about your own identity politics than about what actually happened to a building that had, by then, been gone for centuries. To understand why the library really vanished, we have to step away from those mirrors and look instead at slower forces, power, money, prestige, and the changing incentives that decide which texts are worth copying, which institutions are worth funding, and which memories are worth keeping alive. If you strip away the moral fables and villain stories, you're left with something much less cinematic and much more familiar. The Library of Alexandria died the way most big knowledge projects die. The money moved, the politics shifted. The people whose job it was to care stopped having the power or the incentive to do it. From the beginning, the Moussion and its library were not neutral, timeless temples of knowledge. They were royal infrastructure, a Ptolemaic prestige project plugged directly into the palace budget. You want a universal collection? You need a king who thinks that having all the books in the world sitting next to his personal residence makes him look legitimate, sophisticated, almost godlike. You need that king to spend actual silver on stipends, housing, copying, papyrus, storage, repairs. You need his bureaucracy to keep paying the clerks, the cleaners, the food suppliers, the boat captains bringing in new texts. That is the real engine underneath the philosophy and poetry, stable patronage tied to a particular vision of what it means to be a ruler. As long as the Ptolemies could extract enough grain and taxes from Egypt, as long as Alexandria's trade was booming and the royal cult was politically useful, that bargain held. Scholars got lifetime appointments. The library got new acquisitions. The king got a brain trust and a propaganda piece. But patronage is not a law of nature. It's a line item in a budget. Every time the political situation changed, civil war, a bad harvest, an expensive war with Rome, a shift in religious ideology, that line item was vulnerable. War and fiscal strain don't usually start by burning libraries. They start by quietly cutting costs. Maybe you don't replace a retiring librarian with someone as senior. Maybe you downgrade stipends. Maybe you let a roof leak for a few years before anyone bothers to fix it. Maybe you start using the big, airy halls that once housed books to store grain for troops or lodge soldiers on campaign. We actually see this pattern repeated across empires. When the Roman state is flush and eager to show off its Greek credentials, emperors patronize libraries, fund copying, and endow chairs of rhetoric and philosophy. When the state is hemorrhaging money on frontier wars and internal usurpers, those same institutions start to look like luxuries. Local elites might keep some of them afloat, but the big central archives that depend on imperial salaries and tax exemptions are the first to feel the squeeze. Universal collections are especially fragile in this way. A small monastic library can survive on local donations, the labour of a few dedicated scribes, and the stubbornness of a community that believes certain books are spiritually necessary. A legal archive can justify itself because contracts and tax receipts are tools of power. But a let's have everything library? That's harder to defend when budgets tighten. The texts that matter most to the people currently in charge get copied and protected. Scripture, law codes, key commentaries. The rest, obscure plays, redundant treatises, rival philosophical schools, technical manuals for machines nobody builds anymore, look like clutter. There's also a political risk. A truly universal collection contains works that argue against whatever the ruling ideology is right now. Pagan religious texts in a Christian empire, subversive histories that question imperial propaganda, philosophical systems that theologians consider dangerous, technical knowledge that might help rebels, rivals, or tax cheats. So rulers face a choice. They can keep paying to store and preserve this entire noisy, sometimes hostile chorus of voices, or they can quietly narrow the canon to what looks safe and useful. They don't need to send soldiers with torches to do this. They just have to stop paying for the people who care. That's the hidden mechanism linking power and destruction. Once the Ptolemaic court loses its monopoly on prestige, first to Rome, then to Constantinople, then to new religious authorities, the idea of Alexandria as the place that contains all knowledge becomes less attractive. Emperors in other cities want their own libraries. Bishops want scriptoria attached to churches. Local magnates build private collections that reflect their tastes and alliances. The old royal Mausion model, with its state-funded scholars, living like intellectual civil servants, doesn't fit as well in a world run by emperors who are more worried about frontier crises than about being the next Ptolemy II. Meanwhile, administrative changes keep rerouting the flows of information. Taxation moves from papyrus scrolls in Alexandrian offices to codices in Constantinople. Legal opinions circulate through new channels. The languages of scholarship shift, from classical Greek to Koine, then to Syriac, Coptic, Latin, Arabic. With each shift, some texts are translated, adapted, and copied. Others are left behind. Cultural institutions sit right in the path of these shifts, and they become collateral in struggles over legitimacy. A new regime might take over a library to show continuity, or it might denounce and dismantle it to show that a new era has begun. A bishop might rebrand a pagan collection as a Christian school. A governor might seize part of a building to house his staff. A monastery might inherit a chest of old scrolls and cut them up for binding material because parchment is expensive and the texts don't fit the new curriculum. Nothing about this looks like one big apocalyptic fire. It looks like gradual repurposing. Rooms become offices. Reading halls become chapels. Scribes are reassigned. Catalogues are left unupdated. A generation passes. No one alive remembers which cupboards once held what. And every time there's a riot, a siege, an anti-pagan crackdown, an anti-Christian purge, an anti-heretical campaign, specific groups of scholars and their collections are disproportionately hit. Certain subjects, astrology, erotic poetry, radical philosophy, become awkward to own. Certain authors fall out of favour, and once they fall out of favour, they fall out of the copying cycle. One small loss doesn't kill a tradition. A damaged room can be repaired. A burned wing can be partially rebuilt. A murdered librarian can be replaced by a student who remembers most of the catalogue. But stack those partial losses over centuries, under conditions where no one is strongly incentivized to restore the whole, and you eventually cross a threshold. You go from the library took a hit to the library as an institution no longer exists, not because some enemy of knowledge hated books in the abstract, but because step by step it stopped making sense, politically, financially, administratively, to keep a giant, duplicative, ideologically unruly book hoard alive. What that leaves us with is the real question that matters. Once that patronage system collapsed, once the staff were gone, the buildings repurposed, the catalogue forgotten, what kinds of knowledge could not be rebuilt from the fragments that survived elsewhere? That's where we turn next, trying to glimpse, through the gaps, what was likely lost forever when Alexandria's great experiment in universal collection ran out of power and incentives to sustain it. When people imagine the lost treasures of Alexandria, they tend to picture a few blockbuster titles. Aristarchus's lost book proving heliocentrism, some ultimate play by Sophocles, a single scroll that, if only it had survived, would have rocketed us straight into the space age. Reality is probably less cinematic and more depressing. The works that vanish first are usually not the masterpieces everyone quotes. They're the things nobody is strongly motivated to copy when times get tight. So if we try to outline what Alexandria helped preserve while it was healthy, and what would quietly drop out of the system once that preservation machine failed, several especially vulnerable categories appear. At the top of the casualty list are local histories. Every city of any pretension had someone who wrote the history of our people, often several someones. They recorded foundation myths, lists of magistrates, border disputes, plagues, port improvements, embarrassing defeats that local elites preferred to forget, and petty victories they wanted carved into eternity. The Alexandrian librarians loved collecting these. They gave scholars raw material to reconstruct chronologies, compare political systems, map ethnic migrations. But outside those cities, very few people had a burning need to copy on the archons of Sinope in 3 books. When the central clearinghouse disappears, these texts are at the mercy of small local archives, and small local archives are fragile. They burn in one riot. They get weeded by one cost-cutting magistrate who decides the city doesn't need 800 years of council minutes taking up space. We can see the outline of this loss in the way later authors talk. They refer to works like the Athis of Androtion, the local histories of Miletus, on the peoples of Libya, and what we have now is a title, maybe a 1-sentence summary in a Byzantine encyclopedia, maybe 3 stray quotations preserved only because they contained a good anecdote. Multiply that by hundreds of cities around the Mediterranean, and you start to glimpse how much fine-grained political and social memory simply slipped out of the record. Next come the minor poets and mid-tier prose writers, not the Homers and Platos of the world. Those had entire school traditions wrapped around them. Grammarians argued over every line. Scribes copied them because students needed them. Bishops quoted them. Emperors liked to look cultured by funding new editions. The casualties are the poets who were pretty good, the comic playwrights who weren't Aristophanes, the lyricists beloved in one region, one century, the essayists and speechwriters who filled up anthologies that nobody quite loved enough to champion into a new age. We know some of their names because later critics listed them. There were whole canons of Hellenistic poets we now know only as headings in lost Alexandrian catalogues. Occasionally one of these ghosts pokes through, a few papyrus scraps from a rubbish heap at Oxyrhynchus, half a line quoted for a clever metaphor in a grammar handbook. That is what survival looks like without an institutional copying engine, not a preserved book, a preserved flourish. Then there are the technical treatises. These are especially vulnerable because they depend on continuous teaching traditions. Geometry survived well, in part, because it got embedded in education. Euclid became a standard text. So did some works of Archimedes, but many branches of ancient science didn't get that kind of anchor. Think of handbooks on specialized engineering methods, on automata, on water clocks, and theatrical machinery and surveying instruments used for one dynasty's tax system. Recipes for alloys, agricultural manuals tailored to specific Nile flood regimes, naval architecture ratios for warships whose basic forms went out of use. As long as people are building those machines and teaching those crafts, there's a reason to copy the manuals. Once the institutions that use them disappear, the Ptolemaic court, a particular school of mechanics, a specific bureaucracy, those texts become dead weight. Later compilers might lift a clever trick or a memorable gadget from an older book. That's how we know, from a few references, that the Alexandrian engineer Ctesibius wrote detailed treatises on pumps, pressure, and automata that are now gone. Hero of Alexandria cites earlier authors whose own works are missing. The ancients themselves complained, "So-and-so wrote 10 books on this device. We have only the epitome." Alexandria, with its technical museum and machine-loving kings, was a natural home for that kind of writing. When the court priorities shifted and the scholarly staff dwindled, copying those books would have been an early casualty. Another silent loss lies in what we might call ethnographic and linguistic material. Greek and Egyptian scholars in Alexandria had access to sailors, merchants, diplomats, mercenaries, and slaves from all over the known world. Ptolemaic Egypt ran intelligence on Nubia, Arabia, the Indian Ocean. It's entirely plausible that some of that knowledge got written down in more detail than the handful of travelogues we possess. We have hints. Later authors mention works on the Indians, on the Ethiopians, on the customs of the Scythians, now lost. We know Hellenistic scholars were interested in comparative religion and foreign law codes. We know Egyptian priests in this period were compiling and translating temple archives. A universal library attached to a royal court is exactly the place where someone might have deposited vocabularies of foreign languages, sketches of scripts, transcriptions of royal edicts from far-off kings, not because they foresaw modern linguistics, but because interpreters, diplomats, and priests needed them. Those materials are extraordinarily loss-prone. If nobody keeps using, teaching, and updating them, they age out of practical usefulness very fast. A word list for a Nubian dialect stored in an archive no one visits has no natural defenders when space is needed, or a new regime decides to purge pagan temple papers. Even when texts in these categories weren't completely destroyed, they often lost their scaffolding. That's another layer of loss we tend to overlook, not just lost books, but lost contexts. Ancient scientific and technical works were frequently written to be used with diagrams, models, instruments, and a particular curriculum. Aristarchus's surviving treatise on the sizes and distances of the sun and moon is almost unreadable without the geometric diagrams that originally accompanied it. Some manuscripts preserve rough versions, others drop them entirely. Now imagine a whole shelf of works like that, on mechanics, optics, anatomy, whose figures were scribbled in wax tablets, or drawn on wooden boards, or demonstrated with brass devices that never got reproduced when the texts were recopied. The Library of Alexandria was tied to the Mouseion, a research and teaching environment. There would have been lecture notes, working tables, reference charts, catalogue cross-indexes, exemplar models for scribes, even mundane things like shelving plans. Almost none of that kind of metamaterial survives from antiquity anywhere. We know curricula mainly from late summaries. Instruments survive as rare, decontextualized finds. A stray astrolabe here, a surgical kit there. So when we say Alexandria's books were lost, a more precise way to put it is, the dense web that linked texts, tools, and trained people was torn apart. Some nodes survived elsewhere. An excerpt in a Byzantine encyclopedia, a translated epitome in Arabic, a garbled Latin paraphrase. But the system that made them powerful did not, and that's why it's important to keep uncertainty front and centre. We cannot point to a catalogue and say, here are the 40,000 volumes we know for a fact died with the library. The catalogues, if they ever existed on papyrus, are gone too. What we do have are patterns. We see how many works are known only by title. We see how densely interconnected Hellenistic scholarship was, and how often later writers mention sources we no longer possess. We see which kinds of texts tend to survive in multiple independent traditions, and which vanish almost everywhere. From that we can outline plausible high-impact losses. Not the one scroll that would have given us smartphones by 100 CE, but thousands of narrower, more specific tools, local histories that would let us reconstruct regional politics and identities in far more detail, moderately successful poets and philosophers whose ideas might have taken different paths if later ages had had more than a line or two to judge them by, technical manuals and scientific monographs that, had they stayed in continuous circulation, might have shortened the time between ancient experiments and later rediscoveries, travel accounts and language notes that would give us direct voices from cultures we now know only through outsiders' stereotypes. And behind all of that, the lost glue, diagrams, instruments, institutional memory, and teaching lineages that turned piles of papyrus into living, evolving knowledge. Some of that material really has gone beyond recall. Some of it, as we'll see, didn't disappear so much as change addresses and disguises, because while Alexandria's particular experiment in universal collection failed, not everything it sheltered vanished with it. Parts of that world slipped into monasteries, into Arabic translation circles, into marginal notes and obscure compilations. To see what probably survived, in pieces, in paraphrase, in new languages, we have to follow those paper trails out of Alexandria and into the very different institutions that came after. If you follow those paper trails, the first thing you notice is that books do something very unromantic when institutions collapse. They move. Scrolls that once sat on shelves in Alexandria don't all sit there patiently waiting for a single catastrophic fire. They get copied to other libraries, they get sold off in estate sales, they get carried away by scholars when they change employers, they get stolen, regifted, misattributed, and reshelved under new titles. For several centuries, Alexandria was plugged into a wider Mediterranean knowledge economy. The kings of Pergamon were racing them for prestige. Cities like Rhodes, Athens, Antioch, and later Rome built up serious collections. Philosophical schools kept their own archives. Rhetoric teachers hoarded model speeches. Wealthy book collectors commissioned copies of whatever was fashionable among the educated. When an Alexandrian scholar produced a new edition of Homer or a commentary on Euripides, copies didn't stay bottled up on the Nile. They bled into that network. Some were sent as diplomatic gifts. Others were taken home by visiting scholars. Still others were pirated by rival librarians. So when the Alexandrian machine starts to break down, Some of what it had collected is already out on tour. Then the languages start to shift. By the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, the centre of gravity is moving east into the Greek-speaking Christian cities of Syria and Mesopotamia. There, new institutions take over the copying game. Cathedral schools, monasteries and scholarly circles attached to bishops and urban notables. These communities begin translating Greek works into Syriac, the dialect that becomes a major intellectual language of Eastern Christianity. They're selective. They like philosophy that can be harmonized with theology, medical handbooks that are practically useful, bits of Aristotle that help with logic. But selective is not tiny. Enormous amounts of material pass through their scriptoria. Even when a Greek original later disappears, its Syriac shadow may survive. A few centuries on, Arabic enters the story. The Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad don't get their Greek science directly from dusty scrolls in Alexandria. They get it from this intermediate network of Greek and Syriac manuscripts, via Christian translators who can read all 3 languages. Works of Galen, Hippocrates, Aristotle, Ptolemy, Archimedes, and dozens of lesser names move into Arabic. As they move, they change. A dense mathematical treatise becomes an epitome, a shortened teaching text. A philosophical work accumulates layers of commentary, marginal notes, glosses that swell into separate books, digests that combine several authors under one more marketable name. A compiler extracts the useful parts of 3 or 4 older books and discards the rest. Those transformations sound destructive, and they are, but they're also lifeboats. Huge portions of older literature now exist only as quotations inside somebody else's work. A medical manual we know is gone may live on in the hundreds of recipes and case histories Galen copied out of it. A lost historian survives as fragments embedded in later universal chronicles. A technical description of a machine surfaces as an aside in a commentary on Aristotle's physics. By late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, this is how the ancient world mostly talks to us, in snippets, paraphrases, and hostile misreadings. Canon formation accelerates this winnowing. Schools, both pagan and Christian, start deciding which authors are the authors students must know. A canon of classical texts emerges, first in Greek, then in Latin. Homer, Plato, Demosthenes, certain tragedians, certain historians, certain church fathers. If you're in the club, you get copied over and over for 1,000 years. If you're not, you depend on chance. A lone manuscript in a provincial monastery, one enthusiast who won't let your work die, or a few lines quoted by someone more famous. Even inside the canon, survival doesn't mean completeness. We have 7 plays by Aeschylus. Ancient scholars knew dozens. Livy wrote 142 books of Roman history. Roughly 3/4 are gone. Galen complains that scribes keep mangling his texts, abridging where they shouldn't, swapping chapter orders. By the time Renaissance humanists rediscover some authors, their works have already passed through centuries of silent editing, censorship, accident, and misreading. That whole process depends on scribes, not just a few monks in remote valleys, but a dense network of monastic, urban, and courtly scriptoria from Egypt to Ireland to Constantinople. Monasteries copy scripture, yes, but also commentaries, grammatical manuals, bits of pagan literature needed to explain Latin or Greek. Urban scriptoria in places like Constantinople or Baghdad serve bureaucrats and scholars, churning out texts for schools, courts, and private libraries. Royal and imperial courts patronize deluxe copies of prestige works, then pass them on as diplomatic gifts. Each time a book is recopied in one of these places, there's a fork in the road. It can be shortened, updated, Christianized, Islamized, corrected, or merged with a cousin text. Or it can be preserved unusually faithfully. We usually see only the end result. This is why it's misleading to think of Alexandria as the one great dam holding back oblivion. It was a powerful early node in a much larger, constantly shifting preservation network. As that node weakened, others picked up some of the load. Not everything, not even most things, but enough that when you open a modern edition of Euclid or read Aristotle in translation, you are, in a very indirect way, still touching parts of the Alexandrian world. Not its intact shelves, not its full catalogue, but threads that ran through it were copied out of it, then rewoven into Syriac, Arabic, Latin, and finally into the patchwork of texts that make up our classical heritage today. Even knowing all that, The image that haunts people isn't a patient scribe in a monastery. It's a single night of flames on the Alexandrian waterfront, shelves collapsing, smoke carrying the last copy of some irreplaceable genius into the sky. That picture is sticky for a reason. The library long ago stopped being just a building. It turned into a symbol people plug their fears and hopes into, a shorthand for the idea that once there was a golden age when knowledge was honoured, and then they destroyed it. Who they are depends on who's telling the story. In Enlightenment Europe, they were superstitious priests and fanatical monks. You could tell the story of Alexandria as a martyrdom of reason at the hands of religion, and then cast yourself as the heroic heir, finally relighting the torch. In some modern Middle Eastern retellings, they are foreign conquerors or intolerant Christians, and Alexandria becomes an early episode in a long narrative of cultural dispossession, a warning that your heritage can be erased by people who don't value it. In certain Western culture war versions, they might be barbarians or the mob, or whatever group you already dislike. The same story gets recycled as a parable about cancel culture, or about why universities are supposedly under threat, or about why civilization is always one riot away from collapse. Colonial powers used it too. European scholars arriving in Cairo or Baghdad in the 19th century could point to the loss of Alexandria as proof that natives couldn't be trusted to look after their own heritage. Better, they implied, to ship the best bits to London or Paris for safekeeping. The myth of a burned library became a quiet justification for real-world extraction. When a story can do that much political work, people keep telling it, even when the history underneath is mushy. It helps that the myth is narratively perfect. One majestic building, one fateful decision, one villain you can point to and say, that's who killed the ancient world. Real loss doesn't look like that. It looks like a tax office deciding vellum is too expensive this year. It looks like a monastery that floods and no one bothers to recopy its books. It looks like a language going out of fashion until no one can read the script on the last surviving scroll. That kind of slow erosion is harder to dramatize. It doesn't give you a cathartic scene. So the simple version wins in popular imagination, even though the messy version is closer to what usually happens. And yet, the core emotion behind the Alexandria myth is very real. We do have documented cases where knowledge was deliberately attacked. Qin Shi Huang ordering earlier histories of China burned and burying scholars alive. Spanish clergy in the Americas destroying Maya and Aztec codices because they saw them as demonic. Nazi book burnings in public squares. The shelling of the National and University Library in Sarajevo in 1992. Stacks of irreplaceable Bosnian manuscripts going up in flames on live television. When you've seen that footage, or even just the photographs, it's easy to project the same horror backwards. The story of Alexandria becomes a container for all those traumas at once, a kind of archetypal burned library that stands in for every time power has tried to erase memory. In the information age, that metaphor hits even harder. We live surrounded by more data than the Ptolemies could have imagined, but we also know how fragile it is. Files corrupt, formats die, companies shut down servers, regimes shut down the internet. A single bad policy in a tech stack most people barely understand can make years of writing vanish from public view. Burned knowledge isn't just about paper anymore. It's about lost code, deleted archives, vanished websites, algorithms that quietly make things unfindable. The dread that someone somewhere could hit the equivalent of a delete key and make part of the world's memory disappear. So where does that leave Alexandria? Somewhere in between myth and cautionary tale. We should be skeptical of the neat story, the evil general, the jealous bishop, the fanatical caliph who personally torched all ancient science. The evidence doesn't support that version, and it flattens centuries of complex, sometimes boring, sometimes bureaucratic processes into a single melodramatic moment. But we also shouldn't swing to the opposite extreme and shrug, nothing important was lost. It all survived somewhere. That's not true either. Whole genres of ancient writing have vanished. Whole schools of thought we know only by name. Choices made in places like Alexandria really did tilt the odds for what would and wouldn't make it through. The trick is to let the legend sharpen our questions instead of satisfying them. Instead of asking who burned the library, we can ask what made those scrolls so vulnerable? Who had incentives to copy them, or not? What happens to knowledge when institutions change their priorities, or when the medium itself shifts? Because those are the questions that still matter. If Alexandria became a symbol of how badly a civilization can mishandle its inheritance, the next step is obvious. Look at our own systems and ask how to do better. That's where we're headed next, away from the smoke and ruins and toward the quieter, less cinematic problem of how you actually build structures that keep knowledge alive when everything around them is changing. If you zoom out and strip away the drama, the story of Alexandria looks less like a crime scene and more like a slow curve. First, a wild experiment in accumulation. The Ptolemies create a machine that drags texts from every corner of the Mediterranean into one place. Scholars cluster around it. Commentaries pile on commentaries. For a couple of centuries, the odds that a tricky play by Sophocles or a strange treatise on mechanics will be copied go way up simply because Alexandria is there. Then fragility. The whole system depends on a narrow base. Royal money, royal whims, a single city, a particular scholarly culture. When Egypt's rulers change, when trade routes shift, when prestige moves to new capitals, the incentives that made copying and preserving scrolls worthwhile start to wobble. Then the shocks. Civil wars, sieges, warehouse fires, religious crackdowns, budget cuts, language shifts. Not one neat inferno, but a series of hits over centuries, each one knocking out some fraction of the collection, scattering others, making certain texts just slightly less likely to be recopied this generation, and the next, and the next. Finally, institutional collapse. The museum community thins out. Salaries disappear, students go elsewhere. A library without a living community of readers and copyists is just a room with aging paper. At some point, maybe without anyone even saying it out loud, the chain of transmission snaps. That arc isn't unique to Alexandria. It's what happens any time preservation rests on one pillar instead of many. Keeping knowledge alive turns out to need three things: redundancy, money, and people who care enough to keep using it. Redundancy means copies in different places, under different kinds of control, in different formats, monks and mosques and private collectors. Today, that means not trusting one platform, one cloud provider, one file format, one country's servers. If your life's work exists only on a single corporate website, you've basically built your own little Alexandria and parked it on someone else's waterfront. Money sounds crass, but scribes ate food. So do archivists, librarians, and sysadmins. When funding dried up in late antique Egypt, scrolls didn't magically preserve themselves out of respect for Euclid. When budgets get slashed today, digitization projects stall, backups don't get checked, servers don't get replaced. Neglect can delete as effectively as fire, and then there are communities of practice. A text that no one reads, teaches, argues about, translates or rewrites is already half dead. The works that survived antiquity best weren't always the most brilliant. They were the ones plugged into living traditions, legal codes because courts needed them, scriptures because congregations recited them, school texts because teachers assigned them. Our digital world looks invincible by comparison, but it has its own weird brittleness. We've traded flammable papyrus for flammable business models. When a platform dies, or a company decides a feature isn't profitable, whole ecosystems of writing, video, code, or art can vanish, not in a blaze, but behind a 404 not found. Paywalled journals, DRM-locked books, proprietary formats. These are new versions of putting everything in one royal storeroom and hoping the next king likes books. So one lesson from Alexandria is technical. Make copies, in open formats, in lots of places, with no single gatekeeper who can flip the off switch. Another is social. Support the boring, unglamorous work of libraries, archives, and public repositories. A third is personal. Don't assume something on the internet is safe just because it's convenient. It's worth asking yourself, if someone in 200 years wanted to understand our world, what could disappear tomorrow without anyone really noticing? Niche scientific datasets, independent journalism, fan communities, local languages that only exist as text messages and voice notes? Which of those are sitting in the modern equivalent of a single building on a vulnerable shore? We will probably never know exactly which scroll sat on which shelves in Alexandria, or the precise sequence of events that finally did them in. The evidence is fragmentary, the gaps are large. But the model where knowledge rises with strong institutions and clear incentives, then thins out under instability and shifting priorities, fits what we see not just there, but again and again across history. That's the uncomfortable comfort the story offers. Loss is real, and often invisible while it's happening. Memory is patchy. But rebuilding is also possible. New centres of learning can grow out of collapse. New networks can spread ideas wider than any ancient port city ever could, if we choose to build them that way. If you'd like to be part of that, one tiny step is keeping conversations like this going. If you found this interesting, consider liking the video, subscribing, and letting me know in the comments where you're listening from. And if you enjoy deep dives into how fragile our past really is, you might like the book about prehistoric secrets I've been working on. You can find it at sleepytimehistory.com. However the details of Alexandria's end are finally reconstructed, the question it leaves us with is simple and urgent. What will we make easier to lose, and what will we work quietly and stubbornly to remember?